Good afternoon and welcome to the last week. Actually, just the last 2 days. Today's the second to last day of me reading out loud from He Whistles for the Cricket by Gwen Walker. Gwen Walker was my grandma, and I got this book printed and published for her after she died. She died when I was 7. This has kind of been a family treasure of ours for many years, and when I started publishing my own books, I wanted to give her book in to the rest of my family as a Christmas gift, and just kind of wanted everybody to be able to have their own copy. So, and yeah, so I've really been enjoying reading this again for the umpteenth time, and I hope that you all have been enjoying hearing it as well. And today's chapter is chapter 14, and it's called Christmas, which is hilarious considering that yesterday was Easter, but that's just how things work out for me. So, yeah. Um, it's funny. This is one of those books where you can read it year round. It does have some Christmassy themes here at the end, but if you've been watching and listening along, clearly you know that the whole book does not take place at Easter. A lot of it takes place in the summer. Some of it takes place in the spring, and now it kind of wraps up at Easter and um, Christmas. I said Easter. Yeah, it wraps up at Christmas. Easter in real life, Christmas in the story. I hope you all had a wonderful Resurrection Sunday yesterday. I We had a relaxing day, and we didn't do a whole lot until about 6 o'clock at night when I decided let's go play outside in the snow, because yes, it snowed all day yesterday. We got about 6 to 8 inches of accumulated snow, and you can see pictures on my Facebook or my Instagram. if if you don't believe me, we went out and we made an Easter bunny, and we dyed Easter snow eggs, snow Easter eggs, snow Easter bunny, and we played hide and go snow, which is a game that apparently is just hide and go sneak seek in the snow. My children made it up. Um, Looked a lot like regular hide and go seek, except we were outside in the snow. So that's that. Yeah, that was just kind of our whimsical sort of thing we did last night. Anyway, today's chapter is a little shorter, but I think I'm still only just going to read the one chapter. Tomorrow's chapter will be longer, so tomorrow's chapter might take me more than half an hour, but today's should take me less than half an hour. So I'll get started, and if you missed any of these, you can go to the videos section of my Facebook page and you can listen to the ones you've missed. If you love this story, you can have your own copy on Kindle or EPUB for free. It's free at Amazon in Kindle. You can go to Smashwords and find it free in other formats. If you want the paperback version, which is beautiful and has this lovely watercolor painting around it, it's $4.62 on Amazon, so less than $5. Um, and I'm not promoting this to try to make money because I don't make a single penny on any sale of these. The the Kindle obviously is free, so I don't make any money on that. And the paperback is as close to free as I could get without me having to pay Amazon every time someone buys it. So I don't I didn't do this for money. I love sharing this story, and I love sharing this piece of my grandma's heart with anybody who's interested. So anyway, I hope that you have been enjoying it as I adjust here, and let's get started. Chapter 14, Christmas. Lee Whitcomb had spent 90 days in the Redney jail and was now out on probation for the next 6 months. His fortnight had been spent in blueprinting cunning reprisal for all his persecutors, and now he was free, at least as the boundaries of Redney County allowed. If the probation terms had allowed a wider geography, his pickup truck would not. Though it provided him with transportation, it punctuated his comings and goings with a signal clickety-click noise which identified him to everyone within a radius for 2 blocks, and was a constant source of irritation to himself. When Lee had worked at Olney's garage, Mr. Olney had diagnosed Lee's problem with his truck. He had told Lee it was a collapsed lifter. This, he told him, attached to the push rod, which in turn attached to the rocker arm. Acts like a seesaw, Mr. Olney said. The push rod pushes up on one side, and as the other side goes down, it opens the valve. You can check your oil and keep the pressure up, or you can get it fixed. I'll show you how to do it, and you can do it yourself. It was a generous offer, and one of the things Lee had intended to get taken care of, but things had gone against him, as usual. As the car rattle intensified, so did his anger against Mr. Olney. It was Mr. Olney's fault he'd spent those 90 days in jail. Fault of a bunch of others, too. Jeff Green and that big black mongrel of his, Hank Zender, Mr. Wilson. Lee kept a mental dossier and added small observances from his stool at the lunch counter of the corner cafe, where he spent his mornings over a cup of coffee reading the local want ads. Mr. Olney had come in one morning and had seen him there. He walked over and said good morning, and had even offered to look at his truck sometime. Lee had returned his good morning curt and sullen. He grudgingly found it to his best interest to respond. He might need a speaking relationship with Mr. Olney until his time would come, and it didn't cost him much to be civil. But all the while he seethed at the hypocrisy of Mr. Olney. Put you in jail one day, and offer you his hand the next, he snarled to himself. Fat chance I'd take my truck to him. That was, of course, unless he really needed to get around. It rattled, but it ran, and Lee was acclimated to the inequitable distributions of life. He spent his thoughts in planning how to equalize things as best he could. He noted that Jeff Green came into town often with a little sister who was usually with that dog in the back of a truck. The more he watched them, the more fool he felt himself, because the dog was obviously gentle as a kitten. He watched his chief rival, Hank Zender, and had a special malevolence for him because he had taken his place at Olney's garage. He saw Hank come into town with his dog, Nero. Nero would have been worth hiding from in a tool shed. Lee was smart enough to keep a healthy distance from that one. Lee Whitcomb kept within the limits of his probation, rattled his way to the corner cafe, drank his coffee, read his paper, and picked up occasional odd jobs, and surveyed the town, waiting for his opportunity. He was a patient man. The first snows of December whitened the redny curbs and thresholds of the hardware store, the shops, and the cafe. Storekeepers swept the light dustings over the curbs into the street, and stood leaning on their brooms, welcoming the first signs of the Christmas season. The radio stations played medleys of Christmas carols almost exclusively, and there was a large poster advertising the Nutcracker Suite performance at the Paramount Theater during Christmas week. City employees stood on the tops of city vehicles, wrapping strings of lights and tinsel around telephone poles and street signs. The fire truck with its hook and ladder was used to reach the spire on City Hall, where a star was hung, and across the street on the lawn of the courthouse men moved the figures of the familiar nativity scene into their places between the flat marble cornerstone of the courthouse and the blue spruce which towered above it magnificently. Martha Johnson looked over the bolts of red flannel in the dry goods store and chose 3 yards of soft red plaid to make Ted a shirt. She had made him one like that the first Christmas they began dating. He had been so impressed because his arms were never comfortably covered whenever he had a shirt which fit him properly everywhere else. And Martha seemed to know this, to his amazement. The shirt she made had fit him so well, and he had loved it. As she purchased her material, she wondered if the old pattern would still fit him. She kept all of her old patterns, though she hadn't had time to sew for years. She would find the time to make this shirt, and already she was enjoying the fun of thinking how she would do it without Ted seeing her. Ted had his own shopping to do. He had been thinking ahead for quite a while and knew just what he wanted. Bob Olson had told him about a litter of hound pups born in October sometime, and Ted had gone over to see them. He'd picked 2 of them out. One for Tom, one for Greg, and hoped that Greg wasn't too old to get the same appreciation from a dog of his own he'd once had. He was pretty sure he wasn't. Picking out the pups gave Ted a satisfying feeling and made him wish Christmas would hurry up and come. Now he needed his gift for Martha. At the fair in Redney, Martha had seemed like a girl again. Ted couldn't help thinking this when he heard her laughing with Jane Green over the quilts and the jam and the candle-making. They had tried on hats together and asked the men to take them on rides, and every time they passed a stand, they had wanted to stop for a lemonade or a hot dog or for cotton candy, and they'd even coaxed the men into ringing the bell and shooting at the rows of rubber ducks. He couldn't get over Martha and Jane sticking their heads through those holes in the picture gallery and having their pictures taken, and he'd laughed like he was a boy again to hear them scream at the game where a real mouse was let out of a long tube onto a table. He'd placed money on a pocket in the table at the caller's insistence, and then the caller let go over that mouse, and he thought Martha would faint. Ted couldn't remember a time when they'd laughed so much. There was a jewelry booth there, and Martha had picked up a small cameo locket and held it, almost wistfully, he thought. Ted had watched her put it back, and the more he thought of it, the more he thought how pretty it would be on Martha, and what a good reminder it would be of that day. He had wanted to buy it and put it aside for Christmas, but didn't want Martha to see him. When he was figuring out how he could make an excuse to walk back without Sam and Jane and Martha, Mr. Olney had found them and told them about Jeff's accident. He hadn't forgotten the locket now, as he walked into the only jewelry shop in Redney. The locket wasn't in the window display with the diamond engagement rings, so Ted Johnson walked in and asked about it. "Oh, I know the one you mean, Mr. Johnson," Mr. Hollis told him. He went into the back and came out with a long, flat box which looked like brown velvet. Inside was the cameo locket alongside other kinds of necklaces. "I'll take that one," he pointed, without even asking the price. "Certainly, Mr. Johnson. Would you like for it to be engraved with something?" Didn't think about it. He paused. "That'd be real good. Would it take long?" Ted was anxious to have the gift in his possession, and did not like the idea of going home without it, even though there were still 3 weeks till Christmas. "I can have it done in an hour," Mr. Hollis answered. "What would you like on it?" "To Martha from Ted, I guess," he said, and then thoughtfully he changed the wording. "Make that to Martha with love from Ted." "Well, I don't think all that will fit. Would Martha love Ted do?" "Oh, that would be fine," Ted answered, satisfied. "I'll be back in an hour, then." Ted left, pleased with the memory of the fun in August and the anticipation of the giving ahead. A Salvation Army bell ringer sang out the good news of Christmas as he passed him on the corner and began to cross the street to the hardware store. Midway across, Ted stopped and turned back. He opened his wallet and took out a bill, dropping it into the metal slot of the bell ringer's bucket. On the way back to the hardware store, he found himself humming a Christmas carol. The words, which had been stored for nearly a score of years, whispered their way into his heart as softly as the gentle snowflakes which were still sprinkling the Redney shoppers with Christmas. Mrs. Cheney picked long branches of holly and pine to decorate the mantel over the fireplace. Along the fence, where the pumpkin and corn stalks had been through the autumn season, Mr. Cheney had planted a row of small white pines, which he would replant on the back of the property between the yard and the cornfield in another year. Now they made a border of Christmas, replacing the charm of the Thanksgiving scene. Mrs. Cheney had strung twinkle lights on each of the little trees, and on the fence behind was the wooden star Joshua had cut and stained in junior high industrial arts class. Mrs. Cheney and Sarah had made the small figures of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus in a plaster casting set they had ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog. Mrs. Cheney placed the figures carefully in front of the holly branches, making space for the little lambs and the shepherds, with the 3 wise men a ways off to one side. She hung a star, which had a Christmas tree light as its center over the scene. She twined the cord carefully behind the holly branches and then leaned over to plug it in, satisfied. She would bake cookies with Miriam and her little friend Faith that week. It was a Christmas preparation that should be filled with little girl voices to Mrs. Cheney's way of thinking. Her pantry was ready for them, with its bittersweet chocolate squares and walnuts, and chocolate stars for the peanut butter surprises, the molasses and spices for the gingerbread men, the coconut and brown sugar for the penuche fudge, and the pecans for Mr. Cheney's favorite, pecan crunches. They would fill peanut butter jars with a variety of Christmas cookies, along with round pie tins of homemade fudge, beaten smooth and creamy, and poured just before setting up in the pan, and deliver them to those in town who did them service and befriended them in their community fellowship. It would be fun, Mrs. Cheney thought, to make the trip with Miriam and Faith. Young hearts and young hands certainly made the season come alive. Mr. and Mrs. Green had a surprise for Jeff they just had to let Miriam in on. It was the biggest gift they had ever planned. And having Miriam in on their surprise just multiplied their excitement. They had bought Jeff a truck. It was an old one, but Mr. Olney had repaired it, and the owner had let it sit for weeks. When he finally came in to claim it, he couldn't pay the bill. even though Mr. Olney had said he could just pay a little each week. So instead, Mr. Olney had offered to pay him what he thought it was worth and to deduct the bill, and the man settled. Mr. Olney had offered it then to the Greens. "What do you think, Jane?" Mr. Green had said. She saw and heard his excitement and said the only thing possible. "Oh, Sam, let's do it. Won't Jeff be thrilled?" They had told Mr. Olney not to say anything, and could they leave it there until Christmas? He said they could, and so on weekends Mr. Green would go in and clean it and polish it, anticipating the day when they would give it to Jeff. "I'm going to tie a big red ribbon on it," Miriam told her mother. Mrs. Green thought this was a wonderful idea. "But we can't put it under the tree this year," she laughed. "We can put it right outside the window by the tree, though if the ground's hard enough." Then we'll get Jeff to look out the window. We'll pretend we heard something." Miriam's excitement was almost more than she could hold in. She hoped she wouldn't do anything to let the surprise slip out. She hugged Moses and told him he would be getting something special under the tree, too. He didn't seem worried or left out. Jeff bought Mary a huge box of chocolates and asked Mrs. Green to wrap it for him. He also bought her small pearl earrings with a dainty circle of gold filigree. He had never seen her wear earrings, but these were so pretty he liked to picture her in them. The little box in which they were nested was lined with a small square of red velvet, which seemed to sing out the precious time of love purchases. Faith's excitement in the season was the most she could ever remember. She had been given a gift of $25, an unparalleled treasure from her Uncle Benjamin. Faith knew that he looked so very much like her father had, and at the funeral he had put his arms around her and her mother and couldn't say anything at all. Every birthday and Christmas he would send a little card, but this was the first time he had sent a gift, and it was such a magnificent one. He had even written a little note saying he was glad he could do something for his brother's little girl this year, and for each of them to have a Merry Christmas. He had sent his love along with the gift, and Mrs. Vitale had hugged the little note and asked Faith what she would like to do with such a wonderful sum. "Mother, can I do anything I want with it?" Faith asked her, a little hesitantly. "Of course," Mrs. Vitale answered. "Would you like to save it and think about it for a while, or do you have something already in mind?" "I have something in mind, but I do want to think about it a while," Faith answered her, and Mrs. Vitale was content. She knew her little girl's quiet, thoughtful ways, and it pleased her now for Faith to have such a Christmas gift to contemplate. Faith did not tell her that what she wanted most of all to do was to buy a beautiful new dress for her mother and a silver friendship bracelet for Miriam, the kind so many of her friends at school exchanged with one another. Faith could never have afforded one until now. She would have it engraved and show Miriam by the gift how special she was to her. Maybe, if there was something left over, excuse me. Maybe, if there was something left over, she could buy one of those beautiful poinsettia plants for Mrs. Green, who always made her feel so welcome. And perhaps a pretty red collar for Moses, too. The $25 multiplied into endless possibilities, and sweetened Faith's waking dreams as well as her sleep. As the first week in December came to a close, and Christmas preparations marked a steady incline, the Redney County inhabitants devised bountiful ways of giving of themselves. Mary appliqued a scarf for Jeff, and Martha worked busily and secretively on Ted's shirt. Lee Whitcomb's Christmas spirit also intensified. Jeff and Mr. Green, Hank Zender, and Joshua Cheney all listened each night to the evening news and its report on the war situation in Europe. Britain was holding its own in the war with Germany, but France had surrendered well past a year ago. There was talk of the United States going to war against the Axis powers. Lee Whitcomb had no time for such thoughts. He had other things on his mind. Like the other Redney inhabitants, he, too, continued to plan for his opportunity to give of himself, and when the opportunity came, he was ready. Dun, dun, dun. All right, we'll finish the book tomorrow. I will be back here, same time, same place. Thanks for joining me. Have a lovely Monday.